My studio output does seem to have a direct correlation to how happy I am at work. It's like if I'm really happy at work, I don't really make that much stuff. But if I hate my job, I am like prolific.
Welcome to Artists and Offices, a podcast that explores, through interviews with working artists, the idea that the work you do for pay supports the work you do for love. Or does it? I'm your host, Rebecca Bird Grigsby, visual artist, crafty generalist, and dance enthusiast. Having quit my full-time day job in 2017, I'm currently a recovering artist in offices, rebooting my studio practice while trying to figure out my next career move. Each episode of this podcast explores the perspective of an individual artist juggling their creative practice with their day job. In episode 8, I talked to Oakland-based artist Meine, whose day job supports faculty affairs in art and design higher education.
My name is Meine. I'm 32 years old, and I live and work in Oakland, California. And I think I describe myself, what I do, differently depending on who I'm describing it to. If it's someone who I think might also be creative, I might say I'm an artist and I work at a nonprofit art college. Or if it's someone who I think it's just like a transactional relationship and I'm not going to see them again, I might just say, oh, I work in higher education.
This is so common, and I'm guilty of it too, this tendency to tiptoe around the artist part of your identity, professional or otherwise, when people ask, what do you do?
I've been trying to prioritize or just get myself to feel more comfortable with including artist and in how I introduce myself to everyone, but it's definitely something that I think I have to remind myself to do.
All that said, what is your current occupation, like your current day job?
I'm the Director of Faculty Affairs and Records at California College of the Arts. So I work fairly closely with faculty and academic administration doing sort of HR type work for faculty members, helping onboard them, train them, providing faculty leadership and management with different tools and trainings on how to manage their faculty better, things like that.
So let's back up and talk a little bit now about your path to art.
Art has been a part of my life always. I have a few other sort of recreationally creative people in my family. My mom is an avid knitter. My grandmother is really, I think she would just consider herself, from growing up in the 20s, 30s, 40s, just as a housewife. But I think of her as like an interior designer based on how meticulously she would arrange and rearrange things. When I was growing up, there was only one other member of my family who had graduated from college, and he went to art school. So it wasn't unfathomable. I have uncles who are painters. My great-grandfather was a painter. So it was always really a part of my life and my identity. But I don't think I started thinking about being an artist or even a creative professional as a career until late in high school. I went to a really college or professionally focused college preparatory school from 7th through 12th grade. And so everyone from my high school, everyone went to college immediately. They all went to 4-year schools and became doctors or lawyers or some form of well-regarded professional. And so I think that was definitely the path that my parents wanted to set me on and something that I thought I was going to do up until probably my junior or senior year when I started thinking that maybe there were other ways that I could pursue sort of like academic or like scientific interests that I had, but have that not be necessarily my, like the rest of my life.
And where was this? Where did you grow up?
I grew up in northern New Jersey, about 15 miles outside of New York City. You could see it from where I lived. But it was just like a suburban environment.
Was that, M's studio, where our interview took place, is located in the Control Shift Collective in West Oakland. You'll hear the various sounds of the space and surrounding neighborhood throughout our conversation. Was being close to New York, like, did you go into New York often? Was like the New York art world kind of part of your life growing up? And was that an influence at all, do you think?
I went to museums all the time with my mom. She would take me from the time I was, really young to the Met, to MoMA. I didn't really start paying attention to galleries until maybe I had already decided that I wanted to go to art school, so maybe my senior year. But I spent a lot of time with my friends on the weekends going into the city, but I think actually it was more about like the music scene than the art scene for me at that time.
Interesting, yeah.
Going to a lot of punk shows.
So talk a little bit more, that's a good segue into sort of talking more about your formal training. So it sounds like toward the end of high school, you decided that doing something creative was what you wanted to do, and that I assume you wanted to get some academic training for that. So talk a little bit about what that looked like for you.
So I, like any kid in a college prep school, I spent like my entire summer after junior year visiting colleges, driving around the Northeast to try and figure out what I wanted to do with my life. I ended up applying early decision to MICA, so I just like set it and forget it. I got in there, so that's where I went. And I really loved my experience as a student there. I think, so I went to MICA, I got my degree, and I took 3 years off before going to graduate school at CCA, California College of the Arts. And it's really interesting to me now to look at those two different educational experiences and how similar and how different they are. I think learning at a school that is really rooted in like traditional practices and figurative representation and like oil painting and the history of painters and painterliness was like a really interesting experience as an undergrad. And then to come to the West Coast where a lot, I'd say the education was more focused on like conceptual thinking than material practices. I think that those two different experiences really complemented each other really well.
So did you, when you were looking at undergrad, were you completely focused on art school, or did you consider like majoring in art at a liberal arts college?
I was looking primarily at art-specific schools or state schools with strong art programs. It was like either the really expensive or the more affordable. So I remember looking at like SUNY Purchase or SAIC, RISD, BARD, but most of them were fairly focused on art specifically.
Seems like a good foundation to get that more, once you're at MICA, like to get that more, like you said, like material, how did you describe it? Materials based?
Like conceptual and theoretical versus materials.
But you would say MICA was more materials based.
Way more
and then
materials
you came
based.
to, okay, so I guess during college, but particularly since you had 3 years in between, I know a lot of people, I feel like, go straight through. What did you do for work? And like, can you just talk a little bit about some of your past jobs?
Yeah. So I was really lucky. The summer after my freshman year as an undergrad, I got a job working as a studio assistant for a printmaker. And I was a printmaking major at the time. And it was funny, having that job actually made me change my major and decide that printmaking was not for me, and it wasn't a life that I wanted to have. I didn't see myself working that way forever.
Why? Do you want to talk a little bit about why that is?
I think a part of it was just like, I was really young, and that was my initial response to working with a person who maybe had a difficult personality. But also I think what drew me to printmaking in the first place was sort of the like meticulousness of it, that you have to time how long something's in the acid bath, and like the mechanical processes were really interesting to me. But then I felt sometimes like they could also just hold you back and make it harder to be more fluid and experimental. So I sort of kept working all through college with the same artist as a studio assistant. But after my freshman, sort of a little bit into my sophomore year, I changed my major to illustration.
So you changed your major, but you continued to work as a studio assistant for this printmaker. Okay, interesting.
So I kept making prints with her and in her studio. And it was interesting that the professional development curriculum at MICA was so much stronger for illustrators. Like there were courses on portfolio development. We took a course that was taught by an art director at some publisher who just brought in people to talk about like, this is how you get a contract, this is what you do, like this is how you get jobs, this is how you like ideate. And whereas printmaking, it was just like, well, submit your portfolio to things and maybe you'll get a show. So that was interesting, but then I realized that I also didn't want to work with clients or for clients, so I changed my major again. So I bounced around a little bit, but I worked as a studio assistant for like 3.5 years. And then after I graduated, I got through that studio assistantship position. I got 2 other artists also asked me to start working with them. One was a painter. I just did a little bit of like studio maintenance type work for him. And then another was a mount maker. And we actually got to do some projects that I thought were really exciting. And I worked for him after I graduated and sort of was trying to make a life in Baltimore, living in an apartment, like trying to hold on to that and be independent. Didn't last super long.
What does a mount maker do?
So a mount maker, like if you go to a museum, particularly like historical object museums, the little mounts that are holding those objects in the cases, he would weld them, and then I would color match them.
Oh, wow.
I had like all this painting experience.
That's interesting.
It was really cool. And so when he hired me, he had just gotten commissioned by like the Thomas Jefferson Foundation at Monticello. They were redoing their visitor center. So he was making mounts for every object in the visitor center. And so I just spent the summer like looking at photos and like color painting the things. And then at one point, like a few months later, we actually got to go on site and like touch the objects and like paint them to match perfectly.
That's pretty cool.
It was really cool. It was a lot of fun.
Were these, so any of the jobs that you've talked about so far, were they full-time, part-time, flexible?
It was
a mix.
For working for the printmaker, it was sort of like I had a fairly regular schedule where it would be, like one afternoon a week and then Saturdays, it was definitely part-time, but fairly regular. And then when I graduated, I was working with the mount maker. I don't think it was part-time. I had another part-time job working at a museum, just as they had like an off-site show and they needed someone to sit at the table and make sure it was open. But I worked for him probably like 4 days a week or something. But I had gotten to the point where I had like 4 jobs and I was living in Baltimore where my rent was like $300 and I still was having a hard time. So
did you have any time to make your own work in that time? Or were you thinking ahead to grad school already?
No,
okay.
I don't think so. I had studio space in my apartment, which was like the only time I've ever had a studio, actual studio space in the same place where I live, which was really nice. But I can't actually remember whether or not I was making a ton of stuff at that time. Just a few months after graduating, I moved back home to New Jersey. And that was like a really fallow, quiet time in my practice. I tried to like turn this area of my bedroom into my studio and it just was not working. I was living back at home when I was still working for the mount maker and traveling to Virginia to work on site, and I had gotten an internship at a gallery in New York and sort of thought that was going to be my way into the art world.
The New York art world.
Yeah. I was like commuting on New Jersey Transit into the city to work for free and like pay $15 for my lunch in Chelsea. And like, I thought I was gonna somehow like get my break that way.
So at this point you're like, is this still within the first year out of college? Okay.
Yeah. And I did that, I think I started that internship in like September right after college, and I did it through maybe January, and I think by January I had gotten a full-time job. And that was the job that I had for the entire time until I left for grad school. So I was the studio and operations manager at a hand-painted fabric and hand-screened wallpaper studio.
Oh, interesting.
Which was...
in New York, in Manhattan?
It was in Yonkers. It's the first city north of New York City, and a place that no one ever wants.
So you were commuting from...
Well, at this point, when I first
Jersey.
got hired, I commuted from New Jersey, which was a nightmare. So I moved to the Bronx because it was really close to Yonkers. It was really great because I got to be creative at work every day. So it was a lot of... I produced all of our hand-painted textiles, and so it would be like hundreds of yards of hand-painted fabrics, mixing the colors, matching samples.
So you were doing production.
Yeah.
Okay. Because the title almost sounds more like a administrative / operations kind of position. While I was there were times when me and the owner were the only full-time employees. And then there were other times when we had a full-time office manager and part-time production assistants and a shipping manager. And so it sort of like ebbed and flowed with both like people's availability and how the company was doing at the time.
So it's like I was doing all of our pricing and sourcing and like testing of materials and producing all the work and doing the shipping and like communicating with vendors. So it was a fairly comprehensive position. Also thinking back about how it was like my first real job. And I enjoyed it. And I think it also made me realize how much I needed to be making my own things. It was probably, it's like the studio assistant jobs, mostly I had them either while I was in school or immediately after. And so I was making stuff because I had to make stuff. But having the job at the textile studio really made me realize, like, I can't work somewhere where I'm physically making like creative products all the time, because it just sucked the life out of me for doing anything on my own. I was there for about 2.5 years. The studio itself was it was an old carpet mill from the 1800s. And so the studio I worked in was on the 3rd floor, and then the 5th floor was all artist studios. So in the last year that I was there, I started renting a studio. I think I had reached the point where I was no longer like professionally satisfied with that job. And I was thinking about this earlier and sort of thinking about your questions and preparing for this, like my studio output does seem to have a direct correlation to how happy I am at work. It's like if I'm really happy at work, I don't really make that much stuff. But if I hate my job, I am like prolific. I would go to the studio, I would get to the studio at like 7:15, I'd work until 9, I'd go to work. At 5 o'clock, I'd go upstairs, I'd go to my studio, I'd stay until dark, and then I'd either like take the bus home or ride my bike, and I was there constantly. And it got to the point where being in the studio made me so much happier than being at my job that I knew I needed to find a way to recommit myself to practice, and that's what made me decide to go back to school. Otherwise, I think I had just been thinking like, oh, I don't need grad school, I live in New York, I'll just find a curator to talk to and
get it out there in the world.
Yeah, I was like, I don't need to go into debt to like have conversations about artwork. But then I was like, I need to go into debt to have conversations about artwork.
So you went back to school then. So I'm curious, or you can talk more about CCA at this point. You touched on it a little bit earlier with when the brief period when you were an illustration major. And there's one other person that I've talked to who I think ended up majoring in illustration. And he said almost exactly the same thing, that like professional practices or professional development, whatever they call it at that school, was handled so differently for an illustration major.
The other artist I'm referring to here is Christopher Thomas Ford. Look for that conversation about how professional development varies from program to program in episode 6, wherever you listen to the podcast.
So I'm curious if that, it sounds like that happened in your case as well.
Yeah. And I think I remember that in my senior year, they had just like started some like fine artist professional development opportunities. I remember like taking a workshop on photographing my artwork. I took a workshop on grant writing. I mean, I remember even like having someone come and talk to like the equivalent of like our senior thesis class about filing taxes as an artist, which was super helpful. And like, I think I still have the handouts from all those things somewhere.
That's assuming you make money as an artist?
Yeah, it's assuming you make, or it was about like, and if you don't make money, like this is how you can write it off, but don't do it for more than this many years because that's questionable. And here's the kind of receipts you need to save. Like if you have a studio at home, it has to have a door that closes or you can't write it off, those kinds of things, which was like really helpful, but I wish that it had happened like earlier and more often. It was sort of like well, you're on your way out the door, so like,
yeah, I feel like
taxes.
Right. And I feel like, because I've never had anything even remotely like that. Professional practices for me was like visiting artists, which was awesome, but it was just sort of like, here are a bunch of examples. And they wouldn't even really get into the weeds about like, but how do you make money and how do you do this and how do you juggle everything? And so maybe you could talk a bit about your search for grad school and how you ended up at CCA. And then if you could go back and in that portion, touch on how professional practices was handled in your graduate experience, if that prepared you for being an artist out in the world.
When I started looking for grad schools, I was like, I'm gonna apply to all the best ones. Number one, whether or not I visited them or think that I like them, if they're the best, I'm gonna apply there. And I sort of like took the opposite approach that I took when I had applied to undergrad, where I was like, I'm gonna find the perfect place and I'm going to apply there and that will be it. I cast my net really far and wide for grad school. The only way I narrowed it down a little bit was I went to a graduate portfolio day in New York and actually schlepped some giant paintings with me to show to the different representatives I was talking to. And that actually helped me figure out the types of conversations that I wanted to be having about what I was making at the time, and sort of how to figure out if a particular school was going to be the place where I could do that with people. I had known about CCA, but I hadn't thought about it too seriously until I went to that event. I met Ted Purvis, and, he was a magical person. And I think that just sort of sealed the deal for me and made CCA was my top pick.
Yeah, that's quite an introduction to CCA, from what I've heard.
Yeah. Another thing that became more obvious to me as I was researching different schools and different programs was that I wanted to be somewhere where media specificity wasn't going to limit what I could use, who I could work with, what classes I took. So anywhere I went where they were and this is the painting building. I was okay, well, I don't want to be in a painting building. Mm-hmm. I want to be in just a program where I can paint, or I can shoot photos, or I can make a sculpture, I wanted to have that interdisciplinary experience. And so I started focusing a little bit more on schools that I thought were going to give me that experience. And I also I really wanted to live in California. It was it's funny. I feel growing up so close to New York City, everybody all of my friends from high school live in New York. I always assumed I would just live there. And it isn't really a dream, because it's just when I finally moved to New York, I could technically still walk to my childhood home in 4 hours. It wasn't that far. So it just wasn't that special.
Yeah, moving to New York is not the same thing when you're 15 minutes away.
Yeah, I'm going to move across the bridge. Great. It wasn't super exciting. Getting the opportunity to go really far away was also really appealing.
Was there anything about the Bay Area that specifically that attracted you, or was it kind of California in distance more generally? I
had visited San Francisco once, and I loved everything about it. And I came for a long weekend, and I left thinking to myself, I need to find a way to live here. I had no actual plan for how to make that happen. It was just I just loved the feeling and experience of the Bay Area, and knew that if I could get myself back here, that I wanted to.
So you came here to the Bay Area to CCA, and
you had asked about professional
practices. How was that handled in your graduate experience?
It was more informal, I think. Whereas there were workshops and classes that focused around professional development as an undergrad, I didn't have any workshops or classes as a grad student. I think working with advisors was a good way to actually sort of you're saying about the visiting artists, except I was actually getting to work one-on-one with people and talk to them and ask them questions and see how they had figured it out, and see if their path was a path that I wanted for myself. But otherwise, I took a course on writing reviews and conducting interviews, which was called Reviews and Interviews. It was taught by Michelle Carlson, and it was a fantastic course in teaching me how to look at art in a more holistic and thoughtful way, and how to write about it, and how to market that writing. So one of the things we had to do for the class was we had to pitch a story to a publication that we had no connection to, and just see what happened. And so
kind of a little slice of arts journalism?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
And I had never, it's not something that I'd say is necessarily was at the time or is now an interest or passion of mine, but it was just really great to be exposed to what that requires professionally, and to within the structure of a class, actually have the opportunity to get something that I can, to publish a piece of writing and put it on my CV, which was really great. I think also my experience as a teaching assistant was probably the closest to professional development experience that I got. Although I think being a teaching assistant made me realize that a career as an educator was not something I was interested in. The things that you can't predict about the dynamics of a classroom on a semester by semester basis, that's just a type of stress that I don't I can't deal with.
I can't control
it's
that.
It's like I can deal with stress, but if it's like slightly more structured and a little bit more predictable, as opposed to just like, well, I might hate all 18 of these people and I have to see them for 15 weeks and then I never see them again. You know, I just like made me realize it wasn't.
Was that at all part of your motivation to go to grad school?
In part, I had thought, maybe
teaching.
Maybe I want to teach. Like maybe I want to like, get a bunch of shows and apply for tenure track jobs. But after TAing, I was like, no. One of the most valuable things that I got out of grad school is that I felt like and I don't know what it was other than just the experience of being around that many other people who were exploring their own practices that like with that level of commitment for 2 years. But I feel like it taught me how to have a sustained creative practice, like regardless of if I was a professional artist who did nothing else, or if I did decide to teach, or if I got a desk job, or, like how to just maintain a relationship to making as a constant for like the long term. And I don't know what it was about like the experience that sort of made me feel like, that's what was being delivered to me. But I think that's sort of the feeling that I left with.
I mean, I guess it's a good point because like, even though when you're in grad school, you're not necessarily you're probably not working full time. You are juggling so many other things. Like there's so many things. There's like this expectation that you're going to spend so long in the studio and there's this sort of demand for it. But then there are all these other things that you're required to do that kind of get in the way. But I guess I've never thought of it that way, but that is kind of an interesting way to look at it. Moving on from formal training and professional practices, we're sitting here in your studio, but if you want to describe it, your current studio space or setup and how this compares to past studios. You mentioned that one time that you had sort of a space carved out in your home.
My studio right now is part of an artist collective. So we have a gallery space where we do shows that are open to the public, and then we have 13 individual spaces. When I first became a member of the collective in 2017, I think it was the summer of 17. I initially moved into a different space and then moved into my current space in April 2018. And I use this space mostly for working on drawings, paintings, some smaller sculptural pieces. This past year, I got a flat file, and it actually was an incredibly emotional experience. It made me feel like I was a real artist, because I was like, it was like every professional artist whose studio I had visited or artist that I worked for had a flat file. And it was just like this like dream goal that I didn't know I had, or that I could accomplish by buying a used one at this place in Berkeley for like $200. It was like,
it was that easy.
It was so easy. I've always kept my studio spaces really organized. I like to have like a lot of display and less of the like messy making stuff. Mostly because I think when I'm feeling either unmotivated or like I don't know what to work on, I just organize the studio. Think about all the spaces I've had. In between undergrad and grad school, I rented that space in the building where I worked. It was the biggest studio I've ever had. It had sort of like a front, what I thought it was like an office room, and then a big open back area where I did all my, at the time I was doing all paintings, mostly acrylic, but I think like acrylic and latex paintings, but fairly large scale. I had a couch in there. It was a terrible couch. It wasn't a couch. It was a bunch of 2x4s and like the cushions from a couch that I had gotten rid of. And I would go there before and after work. Sometimes I would take naps up there. I think one time I just like wanted to be in the space and I wanted to be there for a really long time, and I decided to sleep overnight, and that's when I found out that there's lots of mice in the building, and I was like, okay, never again. Like, didn't sleep at all. Just kept hearing them running around. So the rest of the floor was all artist studios, and there was like an artist sort of organization group. We would do like open studios twice a year, and it was like we were kind of trying to do collaborative stuff or studio visits or things like that, but it didn't really take off. I was probably the youngest tenant by about 30 years. Lots of landscape paintings. A lot of people who like I never saw, who just didn't come.
Like, were they there on the weekend? Or
I think so. Yeah. And it was definitely the type of place where like I closed my door and like didn't come out to talk to anyone ever, and no one came to talk to me.
So would you say this is more, because to me, I see that as a benefit of having a studio in a more collective space, is that you have that, just that more of a community that you can interact with more regularly. So it sounds like it wasn't happening there.
Yeah.
It was almost like a private, really, truly a private studio. Is that, I get the sense from what I know about this space that it's a bit more, that's the idea, right?
Yeah,
like,
it's
not,
totally different.
It's private, but it's not like you don't have a door.
I don't have a door.
You have a curtain.
Yeah.
It's kind of open on the top.
It
like
makes a big
the
difference.
physical nature of the space lends itself to, I would imagine, being a little bit more collaborative and kind of, who else is here.
Yeah. I had one other studio after grad school that was in a really similar building to my first studio, where, it's like mostly artists or creative businesses, had a fairly active online message board. So it was like a little bit more communicative. But again, we wouldn't really go talk to people in other spaces. But the space that I was in, I shared with between 2 and 3 other people at a time. It's like a big horseshoe-shaped studio, and we had each carved out our little areas. And it was really nice sometimes when I would go there and other people were there. But then it was so open that I think at times it would have been one of the things I was looking for that I like about my space now, is that like I can pull the curtain aside, I can talk to people when they're here, but I also at the same time have discrete space that I can feel like I have total control over.
It's been kind of interesting to me that more people who have full-time jobs don't have a separate studio space. But I'm curious, like, is that, obviously it's worth it for you to budget that in.
I don't think I'm unique in saying that like money is a motivator for me. If I spend money on something, I feel obligated to use it. It's like, I'm like, oh, I'm going to work out by going for a jog because jogging's free. I'm not going to go for a jog. But if I pay money to like be a member at the Y, I'm going to go to the Y because I pay for it. So like, I know that if I carve out space, or at least in my experiences in the past, if I just tried to be like, I'm going to work at home and I'll like this corner of this room is where I'm going to set up my desk and I'm going to have all my materials, I know that I'm just going to lay on the couch or like read a book or do laundry or leave. I haven't previously felt like I had the discipline that it would take to live and work in the same space. And this is also the closest studio I've ever had to my house, and it is a huge like game changer to not have to like commute to the studio. I love like I can get here in, I think it's like 8 minutes door to door, which is great because sometimes it's like I can go to work, come home, have dinner, and then at 7:30 be like, I'm not tired and I have a little energy. I'm gonna go to the studio, work until 10, and then come home and go to bed. In terms of my work schedule, I work 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. I am really enjoying the work that I do and the people that I'm working with, and I feel like I'm in a really good place professionally where I feel like I'm learning new skills and using skills that I already have and feel supported and appreciated by the people that I work with, which means that sometimes I work longer than 5. I think finding that work-life balance of not getting too sucked in has been a challenge for me more. I think one thing that's helped a lot has been that the people I'm around on a regular basis are all creative. And I think being in a position working with faculty and to support faculty who all teach at a creative institution and all have a creative practice definitely makes me want to stay focused and committed to my own work. I don't know if it would be that way if I worked somewhere else that I cared about, but that wasn't art related.
But so on a typical week when it's not, crazy busy, you're typically like a 40-hour week or whatever, 37 and a half.
37.5.
Yeah, 37.5 hours a week. So when do you fit in studio time?
It varies. The longer I've been out of school, I think the more permission I've given myself to like do what feels right at the time. It was a really big adjustment for me to get used to like real life production output compared to grad school production. When you're like oh my God, I made 5 drawings this week and I did a painting and I made a sculpture. I need to make more. Whereas like if I make 5 drawings in a month, I'm like, that's pretty good. It was a good month. Like figuring that out took me probably like 2 years to like feel comfortable just being like, I don't make things that fast and that's okay. And now similarly, like with getting to the studio, I think there's times when I feel like it fulfills a need that I have and it makes me feel good and I maybe need more of that. So I'll say I'm going all day Saturday, and I'll be there on Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday from 5 to 8 for the next month. And I'll do that, and it'll be really great. And maybe I have something that I'm working towards, or maybe I just like need that in my life. And then there's other times when I just am like, well, if I feel like it, maybe I'll go. And like I've taken like vacations from work just to be like, I'm going to spend 3 days in the studio. And so
you're like patient with yourself and you allow yourself to have that. I mean, I feel like this is a real common thread with our conversation, and I'm hearing it from other people too, where you just kind of have to, otherwise you'll drive yourself crazy, right? Like, yeah, like
I
just
think that's
kind
a
of
good way of putting it. Like patience with how my practice is going to change over time, and not letting whatever's happening at that given point in time be a source of anxiety or concern or stress. If I'm not making anything, I just happen to not be making anything, and I'll make it again. I wonder if part of my like patience with myself in terms of when I'm making things and when I'm not, also it probably has a lot to do with the fact that like I've always had a studio space. You know, it's like I started renting a studio space, I guess it was like maybe 1.5 to 2 years after I finished undergrad. So like, and that's such like a wishy-washy formative time that I feel like it kind of doesn't count, like the time before that. But like started running a studio, came to grad school.
For sure.
Like when I left grad school, I already knew I had like 2 months where I had to move everything into my apartment, but I knew that I was going to be signing a lease on a new space. So like I haven't had any sort of anxiety around where I could make things. I could imagine that it would be different. Like if I didn't have this space and I was just like working from home, I might feel different if I went a month without making anything.
So you talked a little bit before about, you know, just like the creative community within here, and you've kind of touched on it a little bit like in grad school and at different times. So can you talk a little bit more about community right now, like I guess within and kind of outside of, you know, your studio space?
It's something that I have to remind myself to do. You know, I said I went to an opening last week. I think that was the first opening I had been to in like, I don't even remember how long. I don't get out to see work as often as I would like to. And I also haven't prioritized studio visits for a while. And I think a part of that though is like being a part of this collective. There are people around who I can talk to about work regularly, which I don't necessarily think of as a studio visit, but I mean,
you're getting some feedback, or you're having conversations.
Yeah, and so I think that maybe makes it a little bit different. And, you know, like sometimes we have groups come to visit the collective and like do quick visits with a number of different people. So those kinds of things happen, but I don't think about them in the same way as like arranging to have a studio visit with someone one-on-one. But that's one thing that I think is great about the job that I have, is that like there's so many people around me that I can talk to about work, that like I don't feel afraid that like, oh no, how am I going to find someone to come like do a studio visit with, or like I go to them and they come to me. It's like people are everywhere. Yeah, it's not like I like put my work up in my office and people are like, oh, that's a nice hobby, you know, like people get it.
I ask every artist about if and how their day job supports their creative practice in ways that aren't necessarily financial. In order to get the most from limited time, might artists with day jobs try to integrate any of the categories of activities they need to fit into a given week? What are some of the hidden perks of different so-called art jobs?
The role that I'm in now definitely makes me more aware of things that our faculty are doing in the Bay Area. You know, like when they have a show, I probably know about it, and oftentimes I'm interested, and sometimes I'll go. But I don't know that I really have integrated the two. I would say actually maybe the only integration that exists between them is like in so much that like my day job is supporting these professionals who are artists. Having an understanding of what that experience is like is probably maybe a point of integration, but other than that, I don't know that there's a ton of crossover, and I think it actually works better for me that way. I feel more balanced when I feel like I get to use different skill sets between work and studio. It's like if I only have a finite amount of energy to spend in the day, if I use up all the creative energy at work, then there's nothing left for the studio. But like I can like go hard on a spreadsheet for 8 hours and like come up with the most amazing pivot tables and feel really proud of it, and then come to the studio and do something totally different and also still be energized by it. I guess I don't know if this would be an integration, but like there's definitely perks to the type of job that I have where like I took a class in ceramics and it was the first time I'd ever worked with clay, and now I make sculptures all the time and I get to fire them for free because I work at a place with kilns. So, I couldn't do that if I worked most other places.
Right. Or even I wonder if you would enjoy the kind of work you do as much if you were doing it in higher education, but not art and design. Like if you weren't in that sort of creative context and surrounded by, like you said, like seeing, supporting faculty and seeing kind of what they do on a day-to-day basis.
Tuition remission and continued exposure to different ways of making art are a couple of potential perks of working in art and design higher education. For M, the ability to take a class for free in a medium she hadn't previously worked in has also helped her push through periods of creative sluggishness after grad school.
Grad school was like such an intense experience, and everything, there had to be a reason that I was making everything, and I had to be able to explain it like in full before I like even purchased the materials to make it out. And I took a ceramics class for free through my tuition remission, and making functional objects that didn't have a purpose was so liberating. Just being like, it is a cup, it holds liquid, and therefore it's successful. I also made myself not think of what I was doing in that class as part of my practice. It was just like this other thing that happened to be creative and use materials, but it wasn't my practice. And then more and more I started like slipping my drawings into the stuff I was making for class, and having what I was doing with clay influence like what I was drawing. And now there's definitely a lot of back and forth between those two materials. And I find that looking now at the work that I'm making, it's so similar to the work that I was making when I was an undergrad, like 12 years ago, like in ways that are sort of like weird and interesting to me about like why I stopped working that way, or what made me lose interest in it or abandon it or think that it wasn't good or smart or interesting enough.
So let's talk a little bit about showing your work.
I try and prioritize making time for those kinds of things. 2017 was a great year for me. I put my work in a bunch of shows, got to participate in it just felt like a really productive year. And then 2018 was like quieter.
Can you just talk about some examples of like, did you submit your work to exhibitions? Was it through connections?
Most of it was through connections. Like I had a friend who moved to Texas and opened up a project space, and she invited me to do a 2-person show. So I had a show in Texas. I got an invitation from the CJM, Contemporary Jewish Museum, to be part of their Dorothy Sachs show. So I worked on that. And then just like a few other smaller shows that either were like juried group shows or like little things locally. One other show, most of it was actually through connections. Like I had another 2-person show up in Santa Rosa because someone that I know, a faculty member that I know from CCA, was going to have a show and asked me if I wanted to make it a 2-person show with him. It was a really great year, but then like those things don't always happen back to back or constantly. So I think 2018, I had a piece in I submitted a piece to a juried group show, but that was really it. And I'm not the greatest about applying for shows. Every year I've applied for at least one, if not more, residencies. But like I really want to try to see what it's like to fully immerse myself in a making experience. So it's something that I'm like prioritizing for this year, to apply to different one, because sometimes I just apply to the same one. I'm like, I want that one.
And that's one of my questions later, but I guess we can talk about it now, is how do you, I guess, feel about making work that might never be seen or sold? And we haven't really talked about that yet, but yeah, is that an issue for you at all? Like when if you don't have something coming up, how do you stay motivated to keep making the work in the studio?
I don't know. I don't think about that too much, because I think otherwise I would just be really unmotivated. But yeah, it's hard to feel like you have to make the work so that you can complete the application for the thing that you might not get. And if you don't get it, then you should probably make more new or different work, because clearly the old work wasn't standing out. And it's just like, that's probably what motivates me to keep making things. And I think like I don't necessarily need to think about what I'm making as always being for an audience or for other people. And that doesn't mean that like I make work that I don't want to show or that I don't think deserves to be seen or like that it doesn't matter at all. But at the same time, it's like that's not a primary motivator for me.
Yeah. So kind of along those lines, how do you feel about social media? Where do you prioritize that right now?
I'm really bad at it. I tried to take my social media away from being like pictures of a pie that I made and my cat and a drawing and make it more specifically art things. And I use the Instagram stories for the pictures of the pie and the pictures of my cat. But so I've like tried to be a little bit more strategic about that, but I don't post very often, which doesn't mean I don't use social media like Instagram very often. I look at it every single day and I actually feel like I find out about residencies through there. I like see other people's artwork that maybe I'll like take a screenshot of and, it'll lead me in some other direction. So I appreciate it and I use it a lot, but I don't put things on there very often, which I think is more just like, it doesn't occur to me. I'm horrible at documenting things, like really, really bad. And I have thought about selling some things online and it's more just like, I haven't gotten around to it. And it's like, when am I gonna, it means that I have to work on my website, and working on a website is like the bottom of my priorities. I just am like not excited to do it at all.
Yeah.
It's really interesting to think about how like, I don't like having jobs where I'm making creative stuff because then I don't have that energy for creativity. I also hate doing administrative things for my practice. Like I hate updating my website, but I can update a website for work every day and it won't frustrate me. But doing it for my artwork is like a nightmare. But like, and it's not because I don't have the skills or...
would you say is not just a time thing? Like, do you feel that at all where you're kind of like, oh, I could be spending this time making work?
Probably. I think that's a part of it. Like of all the things I could be doing, it just feels like a chore, and it's a chore I just don't want to do, even if it's like to my own detriment. In terms of selling things, I think, it's something that it's a goal for sure. And I think I've started working more in like multiples and like small pieces that I think are the types of things that I would want to sell. But I don't know that I ever see myself like selling a drawing, a large one-off drawing on my website. But I could totally see myself selling a zine or some ceramic cups that I made or, things like that.
I'm always curious to hear, and I think we've touched on this a bit, but if the work you do for pay influences your creative practice and vice versa at all, other than financially.
Definitely something that I remember even as an undergrad being sort of drilled into me as a student, like anything that you do for pay is a thing that supports your art, and to like being told to think of any job I could get that way. And I think that was something that I was really focused. Like I remember having a painting teacher in undergrad who was like, the greatest job for an artist is like an overnight security guard, because you just sit in a building, you don't think, you can sketch, you can write your ideas down, and then you have all the daylight hours to paint. And we were like, but when do you sleep? I'm like, because you need sleep also. But I don't know that I necessarily think that I think it's been helpful for me to think about work that way, because I think that it makes it so that like I've never had to feel like a sellout, or like I'm not prioritizing my work by having a full-time job. Like I think I realized fairly early when I was still a student that like a freelance hustle was not something that I was just like emotionally capable of. Being limited to only being able to plan really short term or at least midterm just wasn't something that I was equipped or interested in doing. So I knew that I wanted to find a job that was going to be more consistent and stable. And so I think thinking about that decision as something that's still like okay and that doesn't shut down, a creative practice and doesn't mean that you're like not still necessarily fully an artist. I think it's been sort of like a helpful way of thinking about work for me.
Most working artists have to choose at some point to pursue multiple part-time gigs or one full-time job. Different things work for different artists, so this is not meant to be prescriptive, but one of the downsides to cobbling together multiple adjunct teaching positions, for example, might be the stress of having a fluctuating income, despite the potential for increased flexibility that schedule would seem to allow.
I feel like there's that idea that you're going to have more flexibility. You might be able to kind of squeeze in time here and there, but I don't know that it always
I think I would just spend the whole time panicking.
Yeah.
It's like any time that I wasn't making money, I would spend panicking about the fact that I wasn't making money and not making artwork. Which I know one of your other questions is about if I would quit my day job. And I think, of course, if I didn't have to have a job, that'd be fantastic. But that's different from the idea of would I quit my day job to pursue creative practice?
Right. Or have you thought about, like you mentioned before, in terms of obviously you wouldn't have to quit your job to go to a residency, but I'm always curious if that's something that people are sort of thinking longer term in terms of and this is kind of my last question, but how sustainable is this for you? Is it something where you're all right, this is working for now, but in 3 years, I hope to be working less, or I hope to be doing this or living here?
The thought of having to rely on my art practice for income just sounds like a different kind of freelance stress. Mm-hmm. And also I feel and maybe this is just my way of placating myself. It's one great thing about not relying on my work for money is that if I tomorrow decide I'm not going to make these black and white drawings anymore. I'm going to do abstract paintings of sunsets. I can do that and it doesn't matter. And it's not I have collectors who are going to say, what are you doing? You're devaluing this work. Or a gallerist who's going to say, thank you so much for working with us, but our contract's over. I don't have to worry about, I can be as loose and as flexible in what I make as I want without having to satisfy anyone. So I don't know that I'd ever want to rely just on studio practice for income. But I definitely think that in an ideal world, I'd have, maybe work 60% full-time, 80% full-time, and have actual weekdays that I commit to being in the studio on a more regular basis. But then I have a hard time thinking what kind of, based on the professional career trajectory that I'm on, how am I going to be the director of faculty affairs just 3 days a week? Or if I move on from that to something else, what kind of part-time setup how does that work? I feel like anyone with a creative practice will feel like any time when they're not at their job is time that they should be at their studio, and finding, not feeling guilty about actual time off, I think is a big challenge. Being okay with staying at home on a Saturday, going for a hike, or watching something on Netflix is when I could have been at the studio in those precious moments of free time. It sort of speaks to what you're saying about time isn't equal.
More information about M can be found at artisanoffices.com. On the next episode of the podcast, I speak with Nicole Kita, a Northern California visual artist and maker who spends her days teaching and advocating for artists with developmental disabilities. Artists and Offices is produced and edited by me, Rebecca Bird Grigsby. Intro music is provided by Mr. Neat Beats. Show notes and additional episodes can be found at artisanoffices.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing to the podcast on iTunes and leave the show a rating or review. This will help the podcast connect with even more artists and offices. Thank you so much for listening.
I feel a psychological need to have access to art making at any time. It stresses me out if I don't have the access, but that doesn't mean I'm going to take advantage of it.